In this section, I want to provide a bit of a baseline knowledge base about general trends about food availability and its links to political outcomes that we're going to be talking about with the literature in the next section. But I thought for those of you who aren't writing your papers on food security, some basic facts and trends, similar to what we've looked at for other outcomes in this class, I think are relevant to make sure that we all are on the same page. Okay, my computer didn't like that. So, food security trends. The Millennium Goals gave way to the Sustainable Development Goals, as we've talked about already. And number two of the Sustainable Development Goals is zero hungry. They're not trying to cut it down by a certain percentage, but to eliminate hunger around the world. So, an ambitious goal. And there are a lot of reports, a lot of data generated about different kinds of food trends. You can go down rabbit holes in whichever kind of direction you want to. One of the major reports that I found really interesting by a number of the largest and most influential international organizations focused on food security issues. The FAO has the state of food security and nutrition in the world in 2020. And you saw a couple of interesting trends over the last couple of years. I think one of the most notable is in the couple of recent years. All of this, of course, happened before the pandemic. Was that the number of undernourished people has been ticking up in the last couple of years? That in 2018, you have over 678 million people who are undernourished. Percentage is about 8 to 9% of the world population is undernourished, and this can two contrasting forces can exist in the same time, right? I think the United States still wins the award as the world's largest population, but there's still millions of people in the United States that don't have enough to eat. This is a trend that's evident in a number of other countries around the world, that countries can simultaneously have people that are undernourished and some that are overnourished, people who have that are overweight. In 2019, 38 million children were considered overweight. The reversals in that previous graph that showed the number of people ticking up slightly that were undernourished are most notable in areas of conflict, and conflict in areas that have drought and floods. There's a couple of graphs I think that make this visual. Where these people are, the food secure people who are food insecure, where they are. The largest population in absolute numbers is in Asia. The second region is Africa, that has the largest number of people who are food insecure. This is most likely to happen in areas in which you have conflict, right? One of those relationships, we're going to talk about how food insecurity can lead to violence, but conflict and violence itself can, of course, lead to food insecurity. One of those endogenous reciprocal relationships that you see, that conflict is basically development in reverse, that it can worsen conditions, especially for those most vulnerable in the world. And you see the dark line at the top are conflict countries, and the other countries are the ones down below in the orange. And so you see areas with conflict are much more likely to have undernourishment, and areas that might not necessarily be in full scale conflict can also be food insecure. A month or two ago now, we looked at the Venezuelan case study, how a high reliance on oil exports allowed for a dramatic expansion in development. I used to be a graduate student in Boston, and there was I don't know how many of you follow the Red Sox, but the Fenway Park is this storied American baseball stadium that was a couple of miles away from where I used to live. And when I used to take the train, I would see the Citgo sign, the gas company in the Northeast that sold gas. actually owned by a Venezuelan multinational state-owned corporation. And during the winters, when people didn't have enough fuel oil to heat their homes, Hugo Chavez came out and said that he would help subsidize the prices and the supply of fuel oil for people who didn't have enough money to buy it in the American Northeast, including in Boston. And so you have this kind of non-traditional example of a developed country getting foreign assistance from another country to try to make a point. But now, in the last 6 or 7 years, that trend has been reversed, and Venezuela is topped the misery index a couple of weeks ago. Has dramatic increasing levels of undernourishment, as well as the lack of provision of other basic necessities within the country. The who is likely to be food insecure. Women are more likely to be slightly more food insecure than men. Over time, this is a pretty consistent finding, although this varies by region. You see women are more food insecure in Latin America significantly. The confidence bounds don't really overlap there. Oceania, there are a couple of years in which that gap is more dramatic. Africa, it's still pretty close together, and so you do see higher food insecurity in women than men, though that does vary by region. So it depends on how you look at the different data. Some of these graphs are from previous years of that FAO report, because different reports focus on different themes, and so I chose ones that were related to conflict. The stunted children under 5 are also more likely to be in areas affected by conflict, because conflict, by definition, is a challenge of the state's sovereignty in certain territories that within that country, and that can lead to states' inability to be able to provide access to specific resources, or potentially use the civilian population as a tool in the conflict. So those are a couple of initial trends about the levels of undernourishment, where and when. The Economist Intelligence Unit also has a food security index. There are a couple of There's the food price index, as I've talked about. The food security index is another one. And like with a lot of the maps we've covered in this class, you see regional clustering of countries performing better or worse. And you see Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, European countries have the best performance for food security, while you have regional different. Venezuela, definitely a hotspot in Latin America for needs improvement, but then also the vast majority of the African continent, as well as South Asia, there are challenges with that. Even Uzbekistan, you see the same ranking as India. What are the different links in that food security chain? The Economist Intelligence Unit talks about a couple of risks that threaten food security. With a lot of the outcomes that we've seen in this class, you see how these human security and conflict and climate risks are connected. They put climate and natural resources as those kind of background scarcity conditions in the back. Financial risks for lack of a safety net, food price shocks that we've talked about already. The difficulty in providing insurance for farmers. Farming is an inherently variable business. They're dependent on the weather systems and the overall climate changes almost more than any other industry, and those kind of safety nets that governments can provide in developed countries when they aren't there can increase risks. Trade. In all my classes, there's always a few students who want to focus on trade, multinational corporations, trade policy, interest rates. It's often overlooked in the connections in the political economy of food and conflict, but how easy or hard it is to move products across borders, as well as what governmental barriers, policy barriers could stand in the way, are quite important to our day-to-day lives. And as we've seen with negotiations about vaccines for coronavirus, these government corporations and individual need can create incentives to cooperate, as well as incentives to go your own way, depending on what you see as in your nation's self-interest. And the last stage, as with Homer Dixon, those political and social risks that we're going to look at: corruption, instability, and violence. For this index, as with for a lot of the research that we've read for this class, as well as for your assessments for this class, focusing, nothing is done without some motivating question, right? And so for the food security index, their central question, and you can see in their methodology section, is how food secure is a country. And it involves distilling it down to a few themes to their core elements, which is basically what we're doing as a research project in this class, as well as in my own research, is trying to make sense of a complex and messy world, pull out the themes that we think are the most important or problematic, and look at them in more detail. And The Economist is doing that as well with their index, as well as pretty much any other index that you can think about. A couple of connections between food security and other factors that we've covered in this class. One, not probably surprisingly, democracy increases food affordability. Governments have incentives to try to provide services to their citizens in order to try to get their vote. And as you can see, as of 2016, you see this positive relationship between being more of a democracy and having more affordable prices. And the one thing I've noticed in my life is how the international system has provided consumer benefits, from clothing to food to white goods to gasoline. A lot of things on a constant dollar basis. The prices have actually gone down quite dramatically. There's costs for that as well, right? The overall results for the Economist Index suggest that Australia is number 16 as of the latest 2019 score, down 4 slots since the last time I taught this class. The number one most food secure country is Ireland, followed by Finland, Switzerland, Sweden, and Norway. Stable, developed northern democracies. While you look at the other side, you see Venezuela down at the bottom at 113th. Yemen, a country that doesn't get enough attention, their conflict and international aspects as well, unfortunately. I really should try to work that into the next couple weeks. The DRC, Burundi, Chad, Syria, Madagascar, Sierra Leone. Less developed countries, more politically unstable. Some are having ongoing political instability or even conflict, and that has follow-on effects on food security. Tying back to a couple of the trends, between 2015 and 2016, more countries saw scores for their national nutritional standards decline. Tying it back to the FAO report, in which you do have increasing levels of undernourishment. Most of the countries that are food secure, 35 out of 40, are coastal. Tying things together with international trade and access of countries to international markets, those in which it's easier to get your goods to other countries are more likely to also be able to import other goods more cheaply, and food instability exacerbates that. Difficulty of access, the lack of secure rules, regulations, and taxation systems can make it more difficult to provide, or incentives to provide, goods to more unstable countries. Tying in with the economics theme a bit, you see wide variations for how open countries' borders are for international trade. Australia is one of the most low tariff countries in the world. The average tariff here, as of the 2016 report, says that 1.2% is the average agricultural import tariff. Contrast that to Sudan, in which the average import tariff was 30%. What other high ones? India, it's 33%. South Korea, 52%. Norway 51%. You have countries that have incentives to try to encourage domestic production. One way to do that is to try to make things from abroad more expensive. Um, while you have developing countries that have relatively low rates, and Singapore with 1.1%. Surprised that the U.S. is 5.1%. Thought it would be lower. Where countries are actually producing has changed over time, and that could also provide changing incentives for tax structures. A couple of weeks ago, I showed you with climate change that wine is being produced even in Canada. The United Kingdom supposedly has some non horrible wines, though I remain to be convinced until I actually try it. But looking at wheat, I have wheat, wheat. I think this is actually produced in Australia. Oh yeah, Australia Durham wheat. So this came from one of the areas in the wheat belt in Australia, which has changed over time. You see in 1990, the areas in green were wheat producing regions. While if you play this through in 2015, you see those wheat producing regions have declined quite dramatically. So if you go back here, where is that going to play? Oh my gosh, I give up. The wheat producing regions in Australia have declined quite dramatically, and those areas where output dropped 50% or more are the ones that disappear. We mentioned conflict leads to food insecurity, which of course can have a reciprocal effect. In South Sudan, in 2011, or 2010 and 2011, before and after independence, there was a lot of optimism that this newest country in the world was going to have resources from oil exports to try to create a new country. The South Sudanese had been fighting the government in Khartoum, as well as factions within the area, and that this is going to be an area of opportunity. Before the government crisis between the president and vice president, you see levels of famine were quite low around the country, relatively speaking. There's a large areas that were stressed, but they weren't in emergency or famine. After the situation, as of this report in 2017, you see areas of famine that were declared. And so you have the political breakdown at the national level and fractionalization into different groups having an effect on areas of famine within the country. Climate-related shocks can also increase food insecurity. You see here the climate related shocks in a number of areas that have had affected conflict. Afghanistan, floods, landslides, droughts, El Nino has been an ongoing issue from DRC to Somalia to Sudan, droughts, floods in other areas. And so you have countries that are politically unstable, and then they get hit with the double whammy of climate-related shocks. I don't know if there's that much research. You have these two separate researches, areas of literature that focus either on climate-related shocks or food price shocks. I haven't seen anything in which you actually look at these in an interactive way. It's a potential area for future research. I showed a more general version of this graph. This one breaks it down to food price surges and links to riots. Those spikes in 2008 and 2011. You see the number of riots and where they actually happened from Haiti, Cameroon, Mozambique, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, right, the Arab Spring in 2011, Uganda, and elsewhere. So places in which you have these food prices for people who are at the margins, or people who weren't at the margins, maybe in the area in the middle, that have the energy and the effort and time to be able to go protest. They can also hit the streets, increase use of violence. This is another one from a published research article in which you see the food price index, or FPI, and violent events also being quite closely related, right? So out of the different kind of links to conflict, food prices is one of the more intuitive, as well as the ones that are easiest to measure, right? And you can raise questions about how easy it is to measure things and how closely they actually get studied. But that also is something that we could talk about in workshop. A couple of takeaways from this brief discussion about major trends in food security and conflict is that food security has been an international priority. A lot of food aid goes from developed countries to developing countries. I can't tell you how many times I've been to places around the world and you see the USAID, the US's foreign aid organization, branded oil or flour or rice or other goods in developing countries. Like with Live Aid, it's easy to try to send things that are visible rather than the money that some countries might actually need to buy things domestically. That's another area of literature, foreign aid, and what the most effective kind of foreign aid is. But food security has been an international priority, is the takeaway from international organizations. Both scarcity and overabundance are issues. Scarcity is something we talk about now, but overabundance is something that I think would be interesting to talk about. Conflict bad. Conflicts make food insecurity worse across for a whole bunch of different reasons. Democracy helps. You have the institutional incentives and the effectiveness to be able to make sure that food availability is around. I don't know about you, but when I went to Costco, probably to stock up on Belgian chocolate in March, I was really struck, and what really brought home the fact that we're entering a new normal is when I saw empty shelves in Costco. I don't know how many of you are actually have been. It's kind of like Americana personified, huge portions in a huge building, and these huge structures in which everything is stored. And there was a run on toilet paper, paper towels, pasta, rice, flour. There's a bunch run on a whole bunch of different things, and I wasn't sure how long these kind of scarcities would last because we're in a democratic system, rule of law in the markets, and the commitment mechanisms and enforcement mechanisms that come along with it, we are now pretty much where we were earlier. But in areas in which you don't have that kind of democratic system, there's been less effective market reallocation. Women are slightly more insecure than men. Another major kind of topic that we can touch on more in the workshop. Climate shocks can also make these kind of food crises worse, and that these price shocks can lead to protest. That is pretty much a couple of the main trends. One question that I thought I wanted to turn this back on you. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how price sensitive you are to your food purchasing decisions. Again, yeah, did you notice any price fluctuations or availability constraints in the early months of the pandemic? Do you notice anything now that's still hard to get or that are at systematically different prices? And how directly tied do you think this is to our feelings of security? And maybe what would it take for us to really want to hit the streets if the price of Vegemite or something went astronomically expensive? If it was Nutella, maybe I would hit the streets. Anyway, so turning back on you, do you have any kind of direct experience with this? And how do you think these individual purchase decisions have an effect at a more aggregate level? So now we're going to turn on to the next section. But yeah, that's it for these few initial food security trends.